This is the panel, The Injustice System Writ Large. And I am sitting here on this stage with some powerhouses who have been doing this work with passion and persistence. And they've been co-powering this work across communities across the country. So I'm going to share their names. I'm going to have them introduce themselves. We have some updates that are breaking news that we're going to share with you around technology and data. And we are going to really talk about existing and current frameworks, whether they adequately safeguard racial equity, privacy, community consent, and reliability. And if this is your first time hearing some of these words, we invite you into this conversation. And we want to invite you to start thinking about how you can co-power these conversations in the communities that you bring with you to your tables. So we're going to talk about all those things. And we're also going to look at where existing systems are falling short through upfront assessment of such technologies, through community oversight laws and other avenues that may offer us a direction and more promise to pursue. So before I introduce the panel itself, do we want to do the exciting updates first and then introduce the panel? By a show of hands, does anyone know what I'm talking about when I talk about these exciting, newsworthy updates? Okay, it's breaking news up in here. It's breaking news. I'm going to give you a little cue. It has to do with the White House. Any more people? Any more people? The White House that's in the United States of America. Okay. Yes, yes. There has been some guidance and direction that is being developed and delivered. So before we jump into the panel itself, I'm going to ask Clarence to kind of give us an unpacking of what has just been released. And we don't have the answers to everything that's been released, because like I said, it really just came out this week?
Literally yesterday and Monday.
Yesterday? So you are at the forefront of this movement with us. So this is the injustice system writ large. We will be talking about predictive policing. We will be talking about social media surveillance. We will be talking about facial recognition technology. And everyone but me here is an attorney. So we'll see how this goes, okay? Is the audience with me? You got my back in case I'm just like, okay, say that again. Are we good? Are we good? Okay. All right, Clarence, break it down for us so that it is unbroken.
Cool. So I will try to be super quick so we can dive into the conversation. As Marika teed up, this has been probably one of the most consequential weeks in AI governance, AI policy, at least here in the United States. As Marika had teed up, this week kicked off with the White House releasing its long-awaited executive order on artificial intelligence. Let me actually just provide a little more context about how we got here before giving some details and just some initial reactions to that document. So this has really been a long time in the making. The federal government has been doing a lot. We'll get into that a little bit later. They have been busy, I'll say it like that, really thinking about how to develop kind of comprehensive approaches to dealing with the various threats that are attached with artificial intelligence. This really begins, I would say, at least with this administration, with the releasing of a framework by the National Institute of Science and Technology. They released this framework about how to assess and mitigate risk related to artificial intelligence. This was about 2 or 3 years ago at this point. That really was a watershed moment because it had this really comprehensive approach to how private industry, how the public sector should be thinking about assessing these technologies. But again, the NIST framework in of itself is what we call non-binding, right? So it's something that folks can kind of take under advisement, but there's no kind of legal accountability or legal authority behind it. Similarly, was that earlier this year? Oh my gosh, was the AI Bill of Rights, which was a similar framework, but a little more expansive, really identifying a series of kind of key principles that the White House and the administration believe were integral in order to really protect the American public from the various harms that flow from artificial intelligence. So there are things in there like safety and transparency, concerns around equity and bias. But again, that was an effort that was, welcomed by many folks, especially in civil society. But again, non-binding, so there's no legal authority behind it. So enter the AI executive order that was released earlier this week. This actually does have legal authority behind it. There are a number of elements that there's so many, I don't want to go through them because we won't spend the entire panel talking about that. But what I would highlight is there are promising elements in there, right? There are aspects really related to particularly AI security and the ways in which certain artificial intelligence systems can be used to threaten critical infrastructure. So think about things like bioterrorism and things along those lines. So that's welcomed, right? There are going to be certain requirements that large AI models are going to now have to go through with the federal government before they can be deployed. And so there's a lot of activity in that space. Unfortunately, when it comes to the civil rights and racial equity space, there have not been the same level of directives coming out of that executive order, right? It's mostly focused on developing additional guidance, studies, things of that nature, which you already have, right? We've seen those kind of frameworks emerge from agencies like the DOJ, the EEOC, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, so on and so forth. So all of that to say is we're in this moment right now where there's a lot of activity and a lot of interest. The White House also released, I think today, I'm losing track of days, a guidance from the Office of Management and Budget. So this OMB guidance really kind of picks up where the AI executive order leaves off, and it kind of creates new standards for which federal agencies will go about procuring artificial intelligence. And that's been a really big concern for a lot of us in the civil rights community, in part because the way in which these technologies are used by the federal government has largely been opaque, has been lacks all kinds of transparency, and has been weaponized, quite frankly, against many of the communities that we care about. So now that we have some of these additional protections, again, it's not the end-all, be-all. While this is legally binding, unfortunately, it's only as effective as long as we have the Biden administration. Subsequent administrations can come in and overturn the executive orders and the guidance on from the OMB. But anywho, all of this to say is we're in a very active moment right now in AI policy, but unfortunately, many of the concerns that we have in the communities that we represent and are a part of are not really having the same type of efficacy that we imagined heading into these conversations. Marika, was that covered?
That was nice and succinct. Thank you, Clarence. Come on with the White House update. Yes. All right, let's take a step back. We just wanted to give you an overarching view of what is the landscape of where we're at. But now we're going to dig deep into our expertise as civil rights attorneys, which I am not, just again, not on television, not on the stage, not anywhere. So let me introduce this panel to you. We have Liliana Zaragoza. We have Clarence Oka. And then we have Mita Nandogopala. And so versus me saying and reading their bios, what I've asked them to do is do a brief introduction of themselves and their work and how we got to this path that you're on this panel with us today. Liliana, would you be interested in going first?
Wait. Oh. Yes. Sure. There we go. Hi, everybody. So my name is Liliana Zaragoza, and I use she, her pronouns. I am currently a professor, although I say I'm very much an accidental law professor. And I also am the AI tech fraud on this panel, because a little bit of what I talk about is more old school. We'll talk about social media surveillance, which is really some of the stuff I work on feels more like COINTELPRO, so it's a little bit more retro, a little bit less, I'm like, when we start to get into machine learning and AI and all those kinds of things, I look to Clarence. We used to work together, so on that note, before coming to the University of Minnesota Law School, where I now direct and started a racial justice law clinic where I teach students to actually practice law and racial justice. So it's not just civil rights, but a pretty expansive view of it. I teach them CRT. We do movement lawyering and can work on anything ranging from housing to cases against the city of Minneapolis and MPD for social media surveillance of the Minneapolis NAACP and Urban League Twin Cities. we'll get into that in a bit. In the previous life, I worked with Clarence at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and relevant to this panel, we worked on some advocacy around the New York City's, New York Police Department's gang database, which is really an excuse to target Black and brown youth, label them as gang members, a lot, again, based on social media surveillance. So that's kind of where I come into the space. But it really is one of the oldest tried and true methods of surveillance. It's just that rather than happening in, physical space, it's happening more and more on online space.
Clarence?
I'm gonna be super brief because I'm tired of hearing my voice. So Clarence Oko, you see him, pronouns, I'm Senior Policy Counsel at the Center for Law and Social Policy, as well as a Just Tech Fellow with the Social Science Research Council. Liliana's like burying all the leads. Liliana's like one of the most brilliant human beings, literally like, I always joke when I started working at LDF, Legal Defense Fund, I was like this, newborn baby, like put, like a little orphan, like we were put at her doorstep. We were like literally on, I think, almost 4 or 5 different cases together. And so much of how I think about and approach lawyering is like informed by Liliana's model and mentorship. So I just wanted to get my flowers. And so my work, yes. So my work principally focuses on the ways in which emerging technologies implicate the rights, civil and human rights of Black and brown communities, especially Black and brown youth. So I am excited to be a member of the Pasco Coalition, which is a group of parents, teachers, advocates from the state, local, and federal level working to end a predictive policing program in Pasco County, Florida, which we can talk a little bit more about later. Also a member of the Notice Coalition with Marika, who I also want to give flowers to, and the entire TCIA family. Notice was really a conversation similar to like this, right? When we realized like, hey, I'm working on these things down in Pasco. Wait, what's going on with the Twin Cities? What's this joint powers agreement, huh? And so Notice really is an opportunity for different communities that are dealing with issues of surveillance, kind of the use of data criminalization impacting Black and brown youth from around the country. So we have our 2 coalitions that are in there, but we also have folks from Texas. We have partners in Chicago, who I believe some of them are here. So it's super exciting, growing, figuring out ways of really bringing that kind of abolitionist approach to dealing with the threats of youth data criminalization. And yeah, I will stop there because I did say I would be short.
Meetha, are you ready?
Sure. I'm Meetha Nandagopalan, they, them pronouns. At the moment, I work at the Innocence Project in the Strategic Litigation Department, which focuses on law reform for the driving causes of wrongful convictions. I think most people who know about the Innocence Project would know it for DNA exonerations, so overturning wrongful convictions. The work that my sort of little subgroup does is a bit different in kind of trying to get at the root causes of why we wrongfully incarcerate so many people. And the specific work that I'm doing focuses on emerging tech surveillance. So things like facial recognition, predictive policing, acoustic gunshot detection, like ShotSpotter, that kind of stuff. And looking at one, sort of whether that technology does what it claims to do, and is or is not reliable in that regard. 2, the impacts when it is disparately deployed in Black and brown communities. And as a combination of those, kind of the underlying question of like, does tech surveillance actually make us safer? And if not, what is the way to get there, right? Can we challenge the assumption that surveillance enforcement and caging more people is the path to safety? What are the radical alternatives that we can imagine that don't rely on those tools of social control? And prior to that, I spent a few years as a public defender in Albuquerque. Prior to law school, I actually taught 5th grade, so shout out to all of the ed folks in the audience. Blessings to those who, unlike me, possess the social and emotional intelligence to work with a group of 30, 11-year-olds all day, every day. I am too socially awkward for that. I learned the hard way. But on the bright side, I have yet to meet a jury that is a harder audience than 30 preteens. So it was excellent preparation for my current career.
Thank you very much. That's got me thinking. All right, so we're going to jump in. We don't want to make assumptions that you are as up to speed as our panelists here. So what I'm going to ask is each of you to kind of lay out, based on your expertise and experience, what is the lay of the land in your particular domain, whether it's predictive policing, the social media surveillance, or facial recognition technology. And for those of us who are new to the topic, can you ground us in both a local and national context about what we do know and what are we up against right now? And I'll let you determine who wants to go first.
I can start, and I'll start with the pieces of technology and surveillance that I'm sort of most embedded in learning about, litigating, and challenging, which at the moment are ShotSpotter gunshot detection. It's a company that at least advertises itself as using microphones kind of placed all around a neighborhood to identify and locate suspected gunfire and then automatically send an alert to law enforcement. There's a whole lot of pieces to that we can get into down the line, but there's questions about its reliability and whether it actually is capable of doing what it says it's doing, and whether it hasn't really been shown to significantly reduce gun violence. And so then, question becomes what do we turn to instead? And facial recognition. Both of those are in widespread use. I think at last count, ShotSpotter was in use in over 150 cities. Facial recognition, I think upwards of 1,800 law enforcement departments have access to facial recognition technology and searches, either internally in-house or through contracts with companies like Clearview AI or Cognitech. And I'll kind of take that in two parts, like what do we know and what do we not know, right? Because there's a lot that we don't know precisely because law enforcement use of these technologies is, I think, deliberately opaque. So on the arenas of what we don't know, in the cities where I've sort of handled cases involving these technologies, what we often see is that their adoption is done with fairly limited public oversight, often through federal grants or funding streams that don't have local oversight. And then their implementation is also frequently not subject to much, if any, public review or consent. So for instance, with ShotSpotter, we can see in the cities where it's been implemented that the neighborhoods where it's installed are disproportionately black and brown neighborhoods. What we don't have necessarily is the insight into who made that decision, why, how, and were residents of those neighborhoods brought into the conversation, consulted? Often not. With facial recognition, similarly, we know that a number of the algorithms in use have been documented to perform worse for darker-skinned faces. So that means black and brown people are at higher risk for being misidentified through a facial recognition algorithm. All of the known wrongful arrests based on a facial recognition hit, currently, black people. Every single one. And so that's kind of the dangers or the pitfalls or the perils that we do know about. But we don't know in most cases, like how often are police running searches on a facial recognition database? Who are they, what kinds of cases are they using them in? Some cities have guidance on this, some don't. It's kind of a scattershot legal landscape. And so the sort of overarching questions that I think about a lot are who bears the brunt of the surveillance. One of my former colleagues, Sarah Chu, and a few colleagues of hers recently did some research and theoretical frameworks on like the idea of surveillance load, right? If you are in a, in a wealthier suburban neighborhood and you walk down the street, how often is your face on a camera versus if you are in North Minneapolis, right? Or Powderhorn. And then second, who is being targeted as a potential suspect versus as a citizen to be protected, right? And when we disproportionately install surveillance technologies in certain communities or encapsulate Black and brown folks predominantly in sort of who's captured in the search, in the gang database, in the facial recognition databases, or whose faces are being searched, what does that do for someone's likelihood of exposure to police contact and likelihood of being identified, prosecuted, misidentified, jailed, and ultimately harmed through the criminal legal system? That was kind of a long answer, but
That was right on point. Yes, thank you. And Clarence, you look like you're ready. You're ready to take up the next.
Cool. Yes. Cool. So I can talk a little bit about both predictive policing and then maybe school surveillance a little more broadly. So predictive policing, folks, show of hands, folks familiar have heard the term predictive policing, right? Minority Report, all that good stuff. Cool. So I won't do the entire spiel, but what I will say is that what once used to be kind of really relegated to the pages of comic books is now a commonplace practice amongst many police departments around the country. So predictive policing is basically the use of data to try and predict crime, either against individuals or against places, right? The problem with that is some scholars have noted, is that this concept of dirty data, right? So the idea is that the data sets that are being used to train these predictive policing models are oftentimes pulling from data sets that we know have profound racial biases and discrimination in them, right? So we're looking at things like arrest records. We're looking at things like, conviction rates. We're looking at all these other different factors that are coming together to really try and not necessarily predict policing, but to produce policing, right? Because at the end of the day, that's really what those models do. The more contact that you have with the criminal legal system, the more contact that you have with law enforcement, the greater those rates of criminalization are, and then you create this negative feedback loop. And so that's the really deep concern that so many racial justice advocates have, is that these systems are really not just kind of expanding existing forms of policing, but that they're really kind of creating this almost police state, right? The surveillance state within our communities, where anybody who's ever had contact with this system is now going to be vulnerable to this type of ongoing policing within their lives. So that seems like, wow, that's like dystopia in and of itself. But it gets worse. So let's talk a little bit about school surveillance, which is how I kind of came into a lot of this work. So around the country, schools are turning to a variety of surveillance technologies, everything from facial recognition, predictive policing, weapons detection, vaping detection. I heard that Philadelphia has drones. So there's, you name it, it is being experimented within our schools. And as folks have already said, a lot of times these technologies are being introduced through, right, federal grants or through philanthropy. A lot of times, because when I first began learning about this issue, I said, wait, I thought schools don't have money. How in the world do they have money to do like a $300,000 contract to give to Clearview or to give to Predpol? But they are using some of these extra funding sources, particularly after we saw that major infusion of federal investments from the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of those dollars that should have been going to hiring more counselors or establishing health clinics in schools were instead going to kind of re-engineering the school-to-prison pipeline. So in particular, the work kind of give a more grounded sense of what this work looks like. In Pasco, what happened was about 3 years ago, the Tampa Bay Times had opened up this investigative report revealing that there was this really elaborate predictive policing program that was being used in Pasco. For a little bit of reference, Pasco is right outside of Tampa Bay. It's like a suburban community, not that large, but they had this monstrosity of a predictive policing system that had been built by this sheriff by the name of Chris Nacco. He is, I call him Bull Connor with a smartwatch, right? Like there's not a technology that this man doesn't love and doesn't want to try and deploy against that community. Subsequent reporting had revealed that there was a data sharing agreement between the local school district and the sheriff's office. So what happened was the sheriff was able to access confidential student records. They were taking the kids' grades, their attendance records, behavior records. They were feeding that into an in-house predictive analytics system. And then they were using that information to develop a database what at the time we thought was 400 kids, but we've learned subsequently is upwards of like 17,000 kids who were being labeled by the police as either at risk, off track, or on track. So the kids who were put in those two highest risk categories were then subject to a variety of enforcement practices. We were able through open records to find out that they had basically turned their SROs into surveillance officers, right? So they're literally intelligence files that they were keeping on the kids. Johnny is talking to this person, check Susan's cousin to see if she knows more information about this crime. And they were taking that information and actually conducting various forms of law enforcement actions against these kids. There's harrowing footage on the Tampa Bay Times website where you can see the officers' body-worn camera footage, them going to these kids' homes at all hours of the day and night, harassing them, giving them civil citations, doing everything in their power to convince their families to, quote, move or sue. And that's a direct quote from the sheriff's office, right? And so what we began to notice as we were looking at this case was, wow, this is really this kind of engineering of this dystopian reality. But what made it even worse, if I can finish up with this, is we had discovered that Pasco County is one of several hundred school districts around the country that's still subject to an active desegregation order. That means that since Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, they have not been able to legally satisfy the conditions of integrating their schools so that they are no longer subject to that federal monitorship. So we have this kind of weird confluence, or this dangerous confluence, between histories of racism, right, and futures of racism. We can see how this system of mass criminalization, the school-to-prison pipeline, mass incarceration, is really reimagining a future for itself by using these digital technologies. And Pasco is such, I think, a powerful example of that. But it's also a powerful example of what resistance looks like. And so that's the work that we have been doing, working with local community folks to form this coalition. We've done open records campaigns to learn about the extent of this practice. We've done policy advocacy, writing letters and talking to everybody and their grandmother from the school board all the way up to the White House. And we have done public education as well to try and make sure that the community has a better sense of what's happening, what's being done with their tax dollars. But at the end of the day, all of that is to say that this is just one example of what is happening in schools across the country, as we are, as many of us are unknowingly, but as many schools and police departments are knowingly bringing these technologies to, again, reimagine that kind of dystopian future for Black and brown young people.
All right, I'm up. So, I will focus on the bread and butter, which is social media, and these two have already shared so much about this dystopian future. And with respect to social media, so there's a lot that I think the public generally knows, right? And some things that I can hopefully add to that. But, even in the last few days and weeks, as I've seen people, for example, protesting out in the streets, I keep telling my students, cover your face. Cover your face, right? And I still see folks not doing that. But on that point, right, there's so much content on social media. Folks, it's very much a part of a lot of folks' lives, understandably. But precisely because there is so much content, right? This is something that since MySpace and Black Planet and the very first, right, and first social medias, police officers, as soon as a new technology crops up, right, they are in it too, right? And so that it was as true probably in the early 2000s as it is today, only now the scope of it is so much larger. And I'll get into also the automation of it in a little bit. But even if we're imagining, right, a single police officer with a covert social media account, for example. So taking the example of the case we brought on behalf of the Minneapolis NAACP and the Urban League Twin Cities, the facts that we know, and there's a lot that we don't know precisely because this was a covert program, right? We know enough to bring a lawsuit, but part of the idea is we sent information requests, right, and we didn't get the information. It was considered non-public. We should hopefully get it through discovery. But we don't know the extent to which they used these covert social media accounts to harass, track, surveil members of the NAACP and the Urban League Twin Cities. We have some snippets, thanks to a state report from the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, but we don't know how deep it goes. We don't know to the extent to which things may have been automated. We don't know whether, so we have stories about harassing messages, for example, that were confirmed by the state agency, messages that perpetuated just horrific stereotypes about Black women and that tried to foment kind of, strife within the organizations. But there's a lot that we don't know. And on the point of automation, right, so in the context of the gang database advocacy that we were working on, based on these information requests that one of our partner organizations sent, they had a campaign in New York called Foil Yourself. So people who wanted to know, am I on the gang database? Because that was also really secretive, right? And the thing about a lot of these technologies is that it's purposely very secretive, and there's an informational asymmetry, right? So in this case, folks from the Legal Aid Society were sending FOIL requests just for a name, like send me my file, tell me if I'm on the gang database. And so for one person, we were able to get information, and you may remember this. There was kind of like an aha moment where we realized this one person's file said that their social media handle had been checked thousands of times. And we had been imagining this as, there's an officer at a computer, like checking your Facebook page periodically. But it is impossible for you to be checking it thousands of times a day. And so even just that information made us realize there's probably some algorithm, something running automatically that is just checking your page. Like, so as soon as you've been identified as a priority, sort of like being an at-risk student, right? Being on the gang database, that means they're putting your name, putting all of your handles probably into some form of code, right? In order to automate the process of checking what's your status. This is another thing too, if you ever check in, to a restaurant or a concert or whatever, do it after the fact, right? Do not post your pictures while you're actually there, right? There are people who are public defenders now who, folks will get arrested who have warrants out for them because they posted their location, and they're like, how did you know I was at the parking lot of the Cub, or because your information is out there. So certainly have your information be private, et cetera, all that, until we can get controls and limits on these practices. But the reality is that we had those aha moments just by getting that information through FOIL requests, and so shedding some daylight on what we don't know is really a huge part of the goal in order to hopefully rein in some of this automation, because there used to be a limit. So for example, with stop and frisk in New York and in Philly and in a lot of places where stop and frisk type policies exist, you have to physically stop somebody. So the upper limit is how many officers do you have, how many hours a day are they doing this, but there's potentially no upper limit to how many touches, how many people you're surveilling when you're able to scrape this amount of data, when you're able to automate the process of checking in on people and their digital lives.
Thank you. Everybody take a deep breath. All right. So we're not going to just also sit in the challenges. We want to make folks aware of the different ways that this is happening, but this panel is also an opportunity for a call to action and figure out your role in making sure that we're navigating differently as we go forward, knowing that resources are being poured into this. So I want to ask our panel of lawyers, what do we need to be considering and organizing around as it relates to civil rights and civil liberties, human rights? When you look to legal movements and organizing of the past, what lessons can we actually learn about how to address these existing threats, and I'll say threats to our democracy? Do we want to go back this way with the panel and just do the snaking?
Sure. Now I know there's a little bit of a lag with the turning on the microphone. And this is again where I'm like gonna look at the real experts. But the reality is, so there are a couple of things. I always look at this like glass half empty, glass half full. And on the half empty, so we just had an argument. I know because you're drinking water. We just had an oral argument before. Like in federal court in the Minneapolis case, because the city moved to dismiss the case. And, you know, the key here is that the organizations were being surveilled on the basis of race. No white people were being surveilled in this way, not even white supremacists, which, you know, as horrible as it is, it's not surprising. And so there, the court seem to be a little bit with us. We'll see. There are these other procedural arguments, but seem to understand the problem here is that they did this on the basis of race. But, and they posed a question that the judge did. She said, but just to be clear, right, this is a legitimate technology. I get all of my cases, you know, so you're not saying that you want to get rid of the use of covert social media accounts to surveil people because this is how my, quote, you know, a lot of the felon in possession cases, so people who have felony convictions, who are found to possess guns, a lot of the evidence against them is, again, don't post photos of yourself with a gun, right? I mean, unless and until it shouldn't be, the onus shouldn't be on us as people, right? But unless and until we can get controls on it, right? Like, this is how these cases, there's nothing you can do to fight a photo of you, right, with a gun, and they just say, here it is, and then you have a felony. And so a lot of judges, they're going to have a pushback of trying to get rid of this altogether, right? And so abolishing the use of this altogether may be very difficult. But glass half full, there are things like facial recognition technology. These things have been banned in certain cities across the country. So like Somerville, Mass, I think both Oakland and San Francisco, or just Oakland? They rolled it back. Well, so back glass half empty, but but there were some bans that have been passed, right? So part of this is, again, with the shedding of the daylight and trying to figure out, listen, there might be no way that we can limit this in a way that will prevent just horrific dystopian and racist consequences, right? And so the more that we can do that, there may be ways to abolish certain kinds of technologies. And that, I mean, obviously that will take organizing and a lot of effort and a lot of, again, daylight, but it's certainly possible.
I think to pick up from there, like scientific racism is not new, right? Like this is a 19th century, if you want to go back further, phenomena, right? So many of the technologies that we're talking about are really predicated on these kind of historical models of racism, right? When you're talking about facial recognition, you're talking about physiognomy and phrenology, these type of like pseudoscientific theories that are being given new life in the 21st century. When you're talking about predictive analytics, Elizabeth Hinton has this wonderful book called From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime. And she talks about in like the 1950s, they had developed predictive analytic systems to identify kids who were at risk of becoming criminals in the 1950s, right? So many of these artificial intelligence, many of those kind of earliest models of artificial intelligence were born in the 1950s, coming out of MIT, coming out of Stanford, and the Department of Defense. And so these fights, I guess, to Marika's point, these fights are not new fights, right? These are old fights, and it is important for us to turn to that historical archive in order to inform how we're building our movements today, and to not treat these technologies as new and shiny and exceptional, but rather as one of the cornerstones for organizing racial oppression within this country. So with that being said, I have comfort knowing that we have these historic movements that we can turn to. We have that archive. Simone Brown, professor out of University of Texas, right, talks about racializing surveillance, locating that practice all the way back to the slave ships, and talking about the ways in which the physical architecture of the slave ship was designed to kind of facilitate a surveillance that made meaning out of the notion of race, that constructed race, right? And that in each one of these moments throughout history, whether you're going back that far, whether you're going to what's happening today, there have been models of resistance. And whether you're talking about the maroon societies of the of the early 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, whether you're talking about the other strategies of surveillance that Simone Brown talks about, watching from below, right? Reclaiming that power by observing, building out our own archives and databases. Right? I think about the work of Ida B. Wells and the Red Record, right? Again, these practices are happening, and a lot of times we don't even have the ability through our existing legal paradigms to be able to actually build change the way that we deserve it. But we can build a historical record that other people can go back to and say, oh, that's how we can continue this fight, right? The last thing I'll say, too, is as we're thinking about forms and models of resistance, is I think what you've heard from all of us is the necessity of interdisciplinary approaches, right? Liliana and I both come from the Legal Defense Fund, and we have seen, right, in the 1950s and 60s, that really brilliant model of bringing these kind of strategic litigation cases that are able to kind of upend these systems. But if you go back again and look at the historical archive, you had litigation and you had it coupled with movement, right? You had a civil rights movement that was happening. You had folks in philanthropy and even the private sector who understood their role and knew how to finance these struggles so that we could continue to fight, right? We had everybody. We had artists. Oh my gosh. I cannot how important it is to have artists in this space. I know that sounds wild, but when I talk about predictive policing, the first thing that comes to everybody's mind is Minority Report, right? If I start talking about any of these dystopian technologies, we have a pop cultural point of reference. So we need to have artists that can help translate these concepts that we're seeing in our work to the masses so that we can really contest. It's funny, whenever we would get into it with the sheriff's office in Pasco, the number one thing that they would say is, this is not predictive policing. This is not predictive policing. Now, we're using data to predict which kids are doing what, but this is intelligence-led policing, or this is focused deterrence, because the term itself, predictive policing, had been soiled because of what the creative class had done to really make this such a toxic concept. So I guess what I'm saying is we have to have this whole of society effort. There's a role for everyone to be involved and be engaged. And then to Liliana's point, there are these grassroots. We are losing on a lot of fronts, but we're winning on some fronts too, right? New York State earlier this month, y'all, time doesn't make any sense to me anymore. New York State banned facial recognition in schools, right? Now, I wish that, the Biden administration would have done the same with their AI executive order, but that's, another fight for another day. And so we see at a state level, right? We haven't seen that before. A state stepping in and doing that. And that was because of work that folks in New York State have been doing, NYCLU and many others have been doing to fight that fight. So we're not powerless, right? That the connections that we're building in spaces like this are really what's going to give us the ammunition, the power, the ability to really contest for change. And so I would say everybody has a role in making sure that these technologies don't engineer another generation of second-class citizenship, another generation of inequality and injustice for the folks who are coming behind us.
I have relatively little to add to both of those, but I would just say, kind of on a broad paradigmatic sense, be wary of any lawyer who tells you that they know how we should be defining priorities in this space. We have a panel of lawyers up here. But I think really going back to what has been echoed in many of the earlier sessions today, communities know what they need. Lawyers have had an extensive education to create a bunch of haze over recognizing that. Law is a tool, law is a technology. It can be a useful one, it can be an oppressive one. but it is just that. It is a tool for organizing decision structures in institutions and societies, for allocating risk, blame, windfalls, and power, really. But I cannot, as a lawyer, go to a client and say, I know what you should need, right? My job is to say, based on how you have defined what you need, here are the ways that law can be a barrier to that, and here are the ways that law can be used to accomplish that. So we need the artists, we need the grassroots. Like, legal change has happened in all of those historical moments that Clarence so beautifully laid out because of existing pressure from other societal sources. Law tends to lag behind grassroots community building, co-powering work, right? And so when we look to those, the ways that technology recreates and reinstitutes existing, long-standing historical models of racism, the ways that it is just the newest iteration of what slavery was, what sharecropping was, what Jim Crow was, what mass incarceration is and continues to be, we can also look to the ways that law was used as a tool in those contexts was most often on the heels of, or in conjunction with, or following broader social movements. And that's sort of what we need to think about and empower ourselves with information to build before we can expect to see legal change most often. And that's not to say that the legal change shouldn't be a goal, but it is to say, let's also not necessarily limit our imagination. That's what this day has been about, right? Expanding our imaginative space, right? Is it helpful to limit our imaginations of a solution space to the dystopia of extensive and racialized technological surveillance to walking back the surveillance or imposing yes, an executive order on AI is huge. It is huge. And can we think more deeply and more broadly about who has access to that technology, who controls that flow of information, and can the communities that are most impacted reclaim that?
Both beautifully said, and also what Mita said is so important, that lawyers should not be, we should be assisting with our tool, right? Especially in movement, we are not the most important voice in the room, and to the point of we should not be figuring out the controls or on the positive end what the imagination is, because let's be real, as educated, the way that having a law degree, right, and based on our experiences, in some senses we may have some connections to these surveillances, and some of my students and I, some of the Black and brown students, were making jokes about how we can tell the difference between gunshots and fireworks better than ShotSpotter can, which is dark, but true. But for a lot of lawyers who are in these spaces, don't actually know what it is like to experience any of these surveillances, don't actually have exposure to these things. The people who should be determining what to do with these technologies are the people who are actually subjected to the technologies.
Thank you for your very thoughtful reflections on this. You've given me a lot of things to think about, even though I talk to you all on a regular. In the interest of time, I'm going to condense the questions, but I'm going to do that by kind of taking you on my journey. So I think about when I really became aware of a lot of these technologies, and my goal often is like, I got to find a solution, I got to find something that works, and we got to do it quickly. And so what I have seen as I become more mature in this movement is that throwing a framework, throwing the guidance at it is not going to get us on the path that we need to be. And so pragmatically, we understand that that is kind of a stopgap, that is the in the meantime model. But I know a number of organizations and groups have released guidance and endorsed recommendations, even the White House guidance that we're receiving, on how to best address these challenges. So where do you all land on like current frameworks to adequately safeguard racial equity, privacy, community consent, and reliability? What do we need to know? Because I know this group, we know not to just rely on that type of regulation or guidance. So where do we put our energy and direction?
Kick us off. I feel like it's my turn now. So a couple of thoughts come to mind on this. So I think in terms of like, what are some of those legal and policy strategies that have bite to them? I am always a huge proponent of bans, right? That we need to draw bright lines around what technologies can and cannot be used. For some reason in the United States, like that is just very counterintuitive to folks. Like they're like, well, every AI technology should be used and we just need to throw an impact assessment at it and that'll make it okay. Whereas like you see in other type of regulatory frameworks around the world, I'm thinking about the EU AI Act amongst others, you see certain kind of high risk technologies being cordoned off for use altogether. And we see some of that in the AI executive order and OMB guidance, that there are certain technologies that are either threatening human rights or I guess rights in general, and then technologies that have national security implications that do have to go through a kind of pre-clearance regime, right? They actually have to be assessed by the government before they can be deployed now. But we need that across the board. Like that's not just about national security issues. We need that for the issues that our communities are dealing with and care about, right? We need to ban things like predictive policing, facial recognition, and other carceral technologies. They don't have a place in law enforcement. They don't have a role in public safety. We know what keeps our community safe. It's not surveillance. It's not continuing investments in the expansion of the carceral state. It's like the systems of care that we've allowed to systematically erode over the last 40, 50 years in the wake of integration. So I think that's like really important, just kind of keep our North Star on the fact that we have the ability to really rein in these technologies through really powerful tools like bans on certain problematic technologies. And we also see really really amazing remedial strategies emerging as well. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, has been using this thing called algorithmic disgorgement. So when you have a really problematic technology, they are basically taking away not only the data, but actually the underlying algorithm as well. And we see scholars thinking about things like algorithmic repair. So all of those different kind of critical frameworks are necessary, but the most important thing, as we've all kind of mentioned, is really doing that base building, really building up a powerful movement that can hold folks accountable at all levels of government.
If you don't mind, I am going to pivot really quickly because I got the ixnay. It's time to close out. So what Q&A. Close out for the Q&A. Yeah. So you'll have an opportunity to expand on some of these things, but right before we start that, not as lawyers, because are you all humans under there? Okay. So I want to know what you think.
AI bot.
I want to know from your heart, from your work and your experience, what might it look like to conceptualize safety and community stability in ways that don't rely so heavily on surveillance? And then we will bring it out to you all, so hold your questions. I think they told me I wasn't following directions. Is that correct?
It's okay. You got
okay. Okay. Please, all of you.
So I'm going to do something. Did you ever see Juhyun Kang? Either of you? Juhyun? Okay, great. There's somebody who I have to give a shout out to, Juhyun Kang, who worked at Communities United for Police Reform in New York City. So I'm going to ask you all to do something for like 15, 20 seconds. If you all can close your eyes. Imagine a time that you felt safe. Maybe your belly was full. Maybe you were with family. Maybe you heard laughter. Or maybe you're in nature. You're not too hot, not too cold. But I don't want to overwrite your feeling of safety. So notice what you feel. You can open your eyes. So, for how many of you was there a cop in the room with you? Which, we were in a room of like 1,000 people, and like the laughter was hilarious. Right? Like it was just even the amount of laughter in itself. Because I think the point being that for a lot of people, right, more policing or more technologies or, it's safety. But in reality, it is housing, it is food, it is comfort, it is love, it is giving people what they need, but also what they deserve. And so I'm very much, it is mental health services. It is, I love my therapist, shout out to you, right? It is all of the things that we should be investing in instead of these technologies, right? And so that's what me as a human, and hopefully a little bit me as a lawyer, right, takes me to work every day.
I again don't have a ton to add to that. But I think here, right, the question that I would pose is, when are our political systems catering to the feeling or the illusion of, or the perception of safety, compared to when are they catering to safety? When are we making decisions based on what is true and demonstrable versus what is advertised to us, right? If you have a company that comes in and says, I can sell you a facial recognition algorithm that 99 times out of 100 will correctly match your suspect to a photo in my database, do we know that that is true? Or are we making that decision based on what is being advertised and a perception of safety, a false perception of safety that comes out of that? So to me, when I think about that question, right, I'm going to out myself as a huge nerd here. I play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. But that is sort of one of my spaces for imaginative world building and collaborative storytelling, and that is sort of the environment in the communities that I play with where I feel safest. But what would it mean for everyone in my city, in my neighborhood, to have space for the kind of collaborative world building, connection, engagement, and excitement that I get out of that through whatever medium they get out of it, right? That is the sort of driving focus of my vision for safety.
Anything else to add? I feel like I've already shared. But yeah, basically my vision of safety very much rooted in invest, divest, right? We have to divest from these systems that are controlling us and killing us, and invest in those systems that actually affirm our lives. So that to me is what safety looks like. And safety is also about getting our time back too, right? Like so much of these systems take away our time through our lives, through distraction, through all the other things. And so I think finding ways of reclaiming that time and that agency back is part of what safety looks like for me.
Thank you. We will turn now to the audience for your pressing questions. Yes.
Hi. Wonderful conversation that has taken place. Thank you very much. I come from a world of information, information security, internal audit, and some other things. And I'm wondering if there might be another way to do the attack of the entities that are developing the software, the AI components, so there's a data science piece that comes into place. And for the entire audience that's here, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the thing called large language models, LLMs. It is a piece and a very important part of building artificial intelligence that's being used for voice recognition, facial recognition, data recognition, and a whole bunch of other things. So just remember that piece, LLM. Now, there's an entity called OWASP, which deals with technology, information security frameworks. And I see a nod from Mitha. I think definitely, Clarence, you'll probably know about this if you know about NIST. And it looks like Lillian is also nodding her head a little bit along the way. Is there a way that we can go after them in the following ways from lawsuits? And this is starting to question, how are you creating these models? Because they are models. OWASP came out with the 10 most critical large language model vulnerabilities. We are so focused right now on the end impact, particularly of our students, and we should be. Can we move further to the left and go after them with specific language? We're coming after you. You're creating large language models. We have industry standards from an information security side that says these models are vulnerable by X, Y, and Z. You need to open up or prove how are you creating these, what are the vulnerabilities behind them, what testing did you do to help to open up the assumptions and inputs that are going into these models to then start to be able to get to the end side or the right side of the equation. How are you using it? How is it detecting it? How is it creating the output itself? Has anyone ever asked about that before or thought about that before?
And if I may, Elizabeth, the question is probably, are there organized movements or actions that you know of that we can be a part of as well, if you do know of those movements or actions being taken in a way that people are going after gun manufacturers until they ban your ability to do that? But, you know, are there opportunities like that to directly engage?
So yes and no. Low-hanging fruit would be OASC and bodies like NIST or the federal working groups on various AI technologies, to the extent that they are in the process of drawing up guidelines and potentially down the line binding regulations. Comment. Public comments actually do matter, and various organizations, networks that Marika and these folks and I am part of will often sort of coordinate stances to submit public comments. Your question is well posed in the sense of, how do we get scrutiny of what developers are now claiming as proprietary technology in terms of the algorithms that they're designing in LLMs, in generative AI and pattern matching algorithms, in predictive algorithms? How can we then scrutinize, one, the algorithm, two, the data that the algorithm is being trained on, going back to that problem of dirty data, and then three, the parameters that it's being used to iterate itself and respond to that data each time it gets a new set of training data to, you know, refine or evolve or devolve the algorithm. That's hard, right? I don't know that I have a good answer. I know that the avenues that like I and others are currently pursuing often involve Freedom of Information Act and Sunshine Law requests where those technologies are being used by public entities. And then two, I mean, I do a lot of my litigation in the criminal legal sphere, litigating discovery issues, so like the requirements for evidence to be disclosed to people who are being prosecuted and charged, or even in civil cases, requirements for evidence to be disclosed when there's a civil rights claim, right? Those can be other avenues to try to get at some of that information, at least in the realm of tools of like law tools, right? Those are not the only tools to use. Those are just the ones that I happen to be most versed in. But I think realistically, that's going to be an uphill fight, and one that will require pressure on all of those fronts.
No, I was just going to say really quickly to that point, like the NIST does call for like this robust socio-technical analysis of AI systems from the design phase, deployment, and then development as well. So that idea of like having those kind of front-end assessments is like something that's very much under consideration, and is one of the features of the AI executive order. They call for like red teaming and other types of strategies to be able to like deal with some of those security issues on the front end. I think the challenge is when it comes to the civil rights domain and like the racial justice domain more broadly, it is incredibly difficult. I'm going to be honest with you. This is the part that I want to tell you. It's incredibly difficult to do these assessments, especially when we really integrate our values into it. Liliana and I, when we were at LDF, were working on a fair lending monitorship of a machine learning, of a machine learning company. It was like 2-3 year project. So Liliana was on the front end, I was on the back end. And when I tell you, y'all, it was a lot. Like it even just like trying to figure out how to map the legal concept into technical terms, like the computer power that was necessary just to do it. It was one of the most rigorous and difficult things that I had ever seen. And we were just on like the enforcement side of it. So I think, unfortunately, the federal government is about to learn this, is they're going to be requiring and developing these standards on their own. It is not easy at all because of the opacity, because of the other challenges with those systems.
Thank you, everyone. This is a great panel. I've learned a lot. So since the LLMs came up, I've been thinking about, there are people who've been warning about these technologies for a while. There's a famous black woman researcher who lost her job at Google from bringing the dangers of these LLMs. And this always makes me think about, I don't know how many people remember the movie Hotel Rwanda when it came out. It was about the genocide in Rwanda. And in one of the scenes in there, there's a reporter around, and then somebody says, hey, can you broadcast this to the TV so people can see this? And then somebody else in the room said, it doesn't matter. People will just look at it, say, that's too bad, pass the mashed potatoes, or something along those lines. So sometimes, I come to these spaces, I'm very energized, and then it just feels like the people who already know this are trying to do something, but then how do you get the general population to like move beyond saying, that's too bad, that's horrible, I gotta pay my bills? So I'm just curious how you're thinking about this, because sometimes it just feels like, we need to do something more than just let people know that this is happening.
Can one of you all take a crack at that in like 2 minutes or less?
Yeah, I'll add something very briefly, which is just, I feel like on the daily, my students will ask me about how do you keep hope, which is kind of part of the question too, right? And some days I'm like, I don't know, and some days, I'm like, we'll do eviction defense cases, and I'm like, we helped one person stay housed, and that's huge, right? So in this context, sometimes it feels like, to your point about public education and getting people and getting the masses to be aware of this, it just takes work. It's real organizing. It's what's really difficult about organizing, right? I had done a stint in organizing in college, and I was like, this just isn't fast enough, right? But that's the real, that is what really makes change, cultural change that might be generational, that takes a while. And the scary thing is that in the technology space, the technology changes so quickly that that organizing in some ways can't be fast enough, but sometimes it can be. And this is where, again, I'm like, I might get everybody in trouble, but in the context of ongoing genocides, even right now, right, there are ways in which it might feel like everybody's just going back to normal, or, some people, how do folks not see this? But I've seen people be incredibly vocal, right? Cultural shifts in the last few weeks. I think that is incredibly, incredibly important. So at some point, when you speak up enough and you raise alarms enough, it can work, right? And so I think that that's critically important. For those of us who can keep sounding the alarms, I do think a lot of people, within the context of these technologies, there's some element of people have kind of accepted the surveillance state, right? Or like, well, I'm being listened to anyway, right? Or, you know, I might as well, in that case, like ask Alexa or Google to do things for me, right? But I think maybe asking people, so there's some degree to which some of these technologies we might live with, but which ones do we not have to live with? Where can we draw those lines that Clarence was talking about, and kind of just continuing to sound the alarms? But if Clarence and Mita have, I'm like, give us more.
So really quickly, speaking on the piece about Palestine, one of the things that just is sticking out to me is I know there were a lot of organizers on the state side who talked about how the Palestinians were the ones who taught them, right, how to handle tear gas. And even on the technology front, like a lot of the technologies that we're talking about were developed and designed by the IDF, refined against the Palestinians and brought over to the United States and vice versa. And it is across, not only in Palestine, but across the Middle East, across Africa and the global South. Like those are the laboratories where this refinement and exchange is happening. And so it's shocking to me on one hand, because it's like, all right, well, what do we do if like everybody's having to deal with this? How do we survive it? But on the other hand, I just go back to the idea, right, that you had these two different movements literally separated by half the globe that were able to engage in that exchange. And it just reminds me, actually, Marika and I were just talking about this earlier, Adrienne Marine Brown's emergent strategy and this idea of building these deeply rooted relationships across different folks that can be able to adapt to changing circumstances, because we know that change is inevitable, right? Octavia Butler talks about change being God, right? Because like it is that thing that just is omnipresent. And so I think figuring out ways of deepening those relationships, both on an interpersonal level, but also on like a strategic level, right? That we don't just need each other because like we need each other, that's true. But if we are going to survive all of these changes and adaptations of white supremacy, settler colonialism, all these other isms and the forms of oppression out there, we truly do need one another and the insights that we share. This panel, I think, is a reflection of that, right? We all have, like, Liliana and I used to work together. Marika and I work together every single day, right? Myth and I have had conversations in the past. Like that interconnection is what brought this conversation together, and is what brought all of us in this room together. So I think that's my source of hope. It's not anything technical. It's not anything that I can, like, really kind of write down, but it is the fact that we have those deep relationships and we're continuing to cultivate them, and we're still here. That's what gives us. That's what gives me hope.
You know, if we're going to be quoting Parable of the Sower here, we got to bring all of it in. Octavia Butler says God has changed, but that book also says change, you can let change be something that gets inflicted upon you, or you can understand it and become an agent of change. And I mean, that's kind of the theology of that book, of Parable of the Sower, and that whole trilogy is like, how do we as humans, right, understand our own agency? And I mean, I think one, like, going back to what you were saying about just sort of accepting surveillance as ubiquitous, right? We need to maintain the stories that fight that baseline shift in the same way that we need to maintain the stories that, like, fight the baseline shift of climate change, that, like, this many wildfires and floods and droughts aren't normal, right? There used to be more monarch butterflies in the world. Like, that sort of generational memory is part of it. And then second, like, yeah, sometimes it can feel like broadcasting a conversation into the void, but at the same time as I'm, writing a comment that I don't know if any administrator at NIST or at OASC is ever going to read to their guidelines, I'm also, like, part of my block association and talking with my neighbors about, hey, do we actually think ShotSpotter in my neighborhood, which is one of the most over-policed neighborhoods in New York City, like, is helping us? Have we seen, do we feel safer because of it? Do we not? Like, what are we doing about that? Can we bring something to our community board meeting, right? That hyper-local, it's still making a difference, right? And it's making a difference for me in that it is giving me something tangible and actionable to stay in this work. And even if I don't necessarily see the benefits of that immediately, like I wouldn't have a law degree if ancestors who never saw the benefits of their advocacy didn't fight for it, right? So that's the perspective that I try to keep in mind, to remember the little things that have worked and try to translate those into bigger and longer term actions.
Yeah, I had one other quick thing. It's just because I keep getting inspired by Clarence and Meetha. But on this point, right, and I'm trying to keep it on the note of hope. So the idea of invest, divest first came out of the Green Haven think tank in the 1970s. So after the Attica uprising, there were some folks who were imprisoned in Green Haven, who were sent to a more maximum security prison after the uprisings. And in there, a couple of folks basically found out that 75% of the people who were getting imprisoned came from, I think it was 7 to 9 zip codes within New York City. And so then they started looking at what they came up with the idea of $1 million block, which is all of the blocks in New York City where the city was spending at least $1 million to incarcerate people. And so then by adding it up, they said, well, hey, why don't we spend that money instead by investing in these communities, all of that money that you're spending imprisoning us, on actual housing, resources, et cetera, for the people in these same neighborhoods. That idea was in the 70s. That idea, nothing happened with it for a long time. Well, and in the 90s there was some traction, and then it went away, so there would periodically be traction. And then all of a sudden, we can talk about, like defund the police, divest. It took a long time, right? And there is still some skepticism, but a lot less so, and it's part of the conversation, just in the way that abolishing the police is even something that we can even say. So, it's one of those things where the folks in the 70s, they tried it, and it just didn't, the idea didn't take hold. And now, unfortunately, a lot of police departments have gotten more investment, but it's still a part of the conversation in the way that it hasn't been in the past. So eventually that message got broadcast enough, and in some ways very quickly over a shorter span of time.
Thank you, panel. I really appreciate the work that you have put in, the reflection that you have done, and you are not unicorns. There are people like you everywhere around the globe that are working on this, and we invite you to be a part of that action, and thinking about where your role is and how you can start answering these same questions with your neighbors and with your friends. And so that it is not an isolated panel conversation, but that, again, this is a mainstream conversation that we are working on together. Thank you for your patience, your willingness to be here, and I don't want to get pulled off the stage physically, so I'm going to turn to Brother Shabazz over here, who has a few remarks to wrap us up and close us out.
Well, thank you, Marika. Those are such kind words. Everyone, and to Clarence and all, Meetha, Lillian, I just really wanted to say appreciate how you arced the conversation. It is about deep networks and connections. That's what co-powering is about. When we opened this up this morning, we talked about how ecosystems really start thriving underneath the surface. It starts thriving in the unseen. The things that actually serve as catalysts to sustain us every day, we don't actually see that metamorphosis, that integration, and that transformation. And what he is saying, what they are saying as a collective, is that we cannot give up hope. The destination is more important than the current state. It's where we're going. And that's what co-powering is about, reshaping that narrative about the future that we own. Each time, one voice at a time, we make it happen. So let's co-power together and see you all tomorrow. Peace.